Hello and welcome again to the second session of Maharana Pratap Annual Security Dialogue. And I'll request Madhav Nalapat sir to formally introduce the session, the speakers, and chair the session. Madhav sir, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. I'm not going to spend too much time on introducing the speakers. We have Ambassador Amar Sinha, we have General Hasnain, we have Ambassador Javid Ahmad, and Dr. Yoram Schweitzer. These are very well-known names, and I think practically everyone here would have been following strategic matters, and each of them are very well known as distinguished experts in strategic matters. Thank you very much for inviting me to be the chairperson. Personally, I've been a little surprised at the manner of President Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan. Not that the ground forces needed to be withdrawn. Of course, they needed to be withdrawn. But the fact that he cut off logistical support to the Afghan army. And the structure in Afghanistan was such that without that logistical support, the Afghan army would collapse, and it did. And then, of course, President Biden blamed the Afghan army, for whose collapse he was responsible. Now, possibly I'm wrong, but I happen to believe that the withdrawal from Afghanistan in the manner that was done has the potential to have the same consequences as Bill Clinton's 1996 decision to install the Taliban in power in Afghanistan. So I hope that's not correct, and hopefully the negative effects of that can be mitigated. But overall, I'm really looking forward to a very stimulating session. I don't want to waste time on lengthy introductions of individuals who are extremely well known, and I'd now like to ask our very distinguished participant, Ambassador Amar Sinha, to take forward the discussion on the withdrawal from Afghanistan and what it means, especially in terms of the global war on terror. Ambassador Sinha.
Just a small interruption. Ambassador Amar Sinha is not joining because he is traveling and he had to see the doctor because of some COVID issues. So we'll have to excuse us for this. Okay, so I think we'll request General Hasnain.
Certainly. General.
I'm very much here. Good morning, Madhav Nalapat. It's good to see you. It's a pleasure to join in with everyone here. I hope I can be heard. Abhinav, can I be heard properly?
Very clearly, very clearly.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Loud and clear, sir. Roger.
Right. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me for this very interesting webinar. And it's always a pleasure to be speaking under the chairmanship of Madhav Nalapat. We have been doing it for many years now. It's always such a pleasure. This subject is very interesting. Post-Afghanistan, the whole issue of terror as such. So let me, in my short time that I have with me, let me just try a very, very brief introduction and then dive into it straight away. First of all, as we are aware, no definition of terror even now. The United Nations has not been able to define it. Everyone keeps understanding, has his own understanding, own perception. One man's freedom fighter, another man's terrorist. That issue is still very much alive. The extreme end of terror that we are looking at is still nuclear terror. The potential of a nuclear weapon falling into the hands, a sub-kiloton weapon, which is something which is still not fully imaginable, but possibly falling into the hands of a terrorist group and being deployed in maybe a subway somewhere or in a restaurant somewhere, etc. And then a tremendous Holocaust virtually, with huge amount of casualties. That's the one end we are looking at. But we are also looking at the fact that terrorism is terrorists around the world. The whole attention towards terrorism of the whole world started with 9/11. The global war on terrorism was commenced at that time. How far has it succeeded today? We will discuss that separately and we will continue our discussions on that. But one fact remains, we have large terror groups like the Al-Qaeda. We have the large terror groups like the ISIS, which may not always remain in the physical state. They could be very well in the network state, which is what the Al-Qaeda today mainly is. The ISIS also largely in a network state, although they've got their core center virtually in northern Afghanistan today. There are medium-level terror groups which don't have that kind of an international networking. Many of the examples are there itself in South Asia, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, etc., which are more, looking at bilateral kind of targeting of areas of local concern, not so much of the international type. And then there are smaller groups which keep emerging from time to time, do come out of such incidents, such as the whole aspect of migration from North Africa, Syria into Europe, and not necessarily all of them under ISIS control, but many of them also proliferating and becoming small level players on their own. So we are looking at this phenomenon now post the American withdrawal. Before the American withdrawal itself, it was becoming very clear that North Afghanistan was the area where there was a vacuum. The potential of gravitation of major terrorist groups into this area was very much live. It was already proven that the Islamic State for Harassah, which was already there, the Al-Qaeda, which was virtually a guest artist of the Taliban, which was in Afghanistan, and this area of North Afghanistan was emerging primarily for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons was the existence of a fair amount of money in that area, and money is one of the major requirements for a terror campaign to continue successfully. This is the area where the drug conduits, the one end of the very famous crescent, the very famous crescent was also present here. The new great game, which of course has got dimensions such as infrastructure, energy, and things like that. One of the major domains of this whole new great game has been ideology, and it was expected that this area, which is nascent Islam, which was at one time under the Soviet Union, which continued to sort of resist the onslaught of radicalism, etc. This is one area which has the potential for growth of radical ideology. So that is again the proximity to North Afghanistan, which made it a very potent kind of an area for this kind of a thing. So this was already pre-withdrawal that the situation had come about. Post-withdrawal now, obviously everyone was looking at a couple of things. Number one, the inspirational message which was going out, which had gone out from the fact that the Taliban, using virtual hybrid methods, using terror as one of the components of those hybrid methods, had targeted a superpower and defeated it in 20 years, not allowed it to succeed in converting that area to its own requirements and needs. And here, this success would probably be a great inspiration to terror groups around the world. That's the message which has gone out very clearly from them. Also, the fact that the space opened out tremendously. So if there's a need for physical space, for example, the Islamic State, which existed with its physical space in Syria, in northern Iraq, and places like that, when it was displaced from there, if you remember in 2018, it looked for places around the world to find itself a physical domain. It looked for it in Marawi, in Philippines, got defeated there. It tried it even in Bangladesh to a great extent, but finally settled for this area of North Afghanistan, which was proving to be an area which was very conducive to this kind of activity. And now with the situation as it is at the moment, with the Taliban, with the internecine problems within the Taliban, you are finding that people are generally imagining that the global war on terror had ended with the American success, so-called perceptions of success, but the possibility of the return of terror, the bounce back of terror. 2018 was considered a cusp year, a year in which the displacement of the ISIS from the Middle East had virtually sent out a message as if terror was now receding. But the success in Afghanistan, the return, the move out of the Americans from there has created opportunities. So are we looking at a bounce back by the various elements within which are the drivers of terror as such? One of the major aspects we ought to need to remember is that while fighting terror, most nations count on their success very prematurely. Mostly it's a success in terms of killing of personalities, elimination of personalities, neutralization of a large number of groups in a particular year, and a large number of terrorists, a bean count, so to say. What most nations, what most groups do not go for is essentially counter networks. And the one thing which always helps in the return of terror, anyway, is the presence of networks. Now, this is if you see the classic example, it's in Afghanistan itself, networks are still very much alive. The Islamic State, having been defeated and having been evicted from Iraq and Syria, the networks for it are still very much alive. There are, in the Middle East, there are areas from where much of this bounce back can take place again. It starts from Libya. There's one end of the whole graph, that is Libya. From Libya, if you come to Syria and Iraq, the conditions in North Syria, in Syria and northern Iraq continue to persist. There is Yemen, where you have the proxies, the Houthis, who are working, and the different proxies from the Iranian side, which continue to work there. So the whole concept of Iranian domination in this area is also based on proxies and the whole concept of hybrid conflict. So none of the networks really saying have been neutralized as such. They are down. They are temporarily down for some time. The whole you see this invariably happening on the Israel-Palestinian side, Israel against Hamas, Israel against Hezbollah. You will find relative periods of a year, 2 years of tenuous kind of a peace, and then a bounce back coming back all over again. That's because mostly you will never find networks actually getting fully neutralized. So that's an aspect that we always need to keep in mind. Now, if it comes to Central Asia, you see one domain is Middle East, where the revival of terror is always there. Maybe not to the levels to which the ISIS had gone at a particular time in 2014, 15, 16. But yes, the early stages of a potential revival are always there. The possibility, the feasibility, and in fact, the almost certainty of the American withdrawal of focus and attention from the Middle East will make a difference. Although the Abrahamic Accords, politically, on the political strategic side, will also help in neutralizing the move out of the Americans, or you can say the dilution of focus of the United States as it moves its attention further eastwards towards the Indo-Pacific. Coming to Central Asia, I already described Central Asia, geographically a region very conducive to this. Besides the drug circuits, you must also remember this is the area which has got weak governments. It's also an area where a potential of a fair amount of money exists. Turkmenistan, for example, the sixth largest natural gas producer. Also a lot of other energy conduits and circuits which exist here. There are a large number of radical groups which have been here for quite some time. The East Turkestan Islamic movement, for example, the one which also targets Western China, Xinjiang, and places like that, also causes considerable concern. So all these groups are very much here. All of them are looking for opportunities, and in that entire crucible, you find landing up the Lashkar-e-Toiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, and groups which are coming out from Pakistan into this. So let's take our attention to Pakistan. As far as Pakistan is concerned, and before I come to Pakistan, let me also say this, that there is a transition in the nature of terror. Remember, when we used to relate to terror in the 80s and the 90s, perhaps terror, it was only in the physicality of it, the immediate casualties, the bean count in the terms of how many casualties have been inflicted by terrorists, etc. Today, as a part of the use of terror as a domain of hybrid warfare itself, you also find the information domain, the aspect of psychological warfare, changing the mindset, uh, a cultivation of ideas and philosophies and ideologies into the basic population there. All this has taken a larger kind of has come into a larger picture. And it's not just the physicality of it. Much of it is based upon and is primarily exploiting rapidly moving technology, 4G, 5G coming into various areas, social media coming into various areas. So the preparation of grounds, training, the feasibility of remaining well networked, all this is playing out in a much, much bigger way than it ever happened in the past. And therefore, we cannot imagine that with all this emerging technology, terrorism is actually taking a back step. It's not. Actually, all the potential for the future very much remains there. Move away from Central Asia. Let me come to Pakistan. Let me come to closer home in the last 5 minutes or so. Let me speak of Kashmir. And what worries me is not so much Kashmir today. What worries me more in our domain is Punjab. And what worries me is the continuum of Kashmir with Punjab. I've written this a number of pieces on this because I keep observing this and I find the area of Jammu, Pathankot, Gurdaspur, for example, a very live area. This is the kind of area where you can have a lot of a return of what existed in the past. A lot of efforts were made in 2014, 15, 16 and didn't really work. Today, those efforts may get renewed once again. If there are awkward political kind of activities in Punjab, they could lead to, these networks which are very much there. If you remember, Pakistan withdrew its hand from Punjab sometime in 1990, 91, 92 to move its focus and attention to Kashmir. But to my mind, the networks were never neutralized because we were never aware that networks is actually the heart of the whole issue of terror. And these networks continue to probably thrive there. We saw what happened to Punjab in the later years with the whole issue of non-contact warfare, the bringing in of drugs out there, affecting the population with drugs and things like that. Now, I think Pakistan is much more emboldened with what has happened in Afghanistan. It perceives Afghanistan as a success. We may not consider it a success, but Pakistan perceives that it has succeeded hugely in Afghanistan, and that the presence of China in Ladakh, the presence of China with its interests in Afghanistan, in the new great game area, and looking for guidance from Pakistan at most times, that advantage today has arrived in favor of Pakistan. Pakistan probably perceives that there can be a upping of the ante, a couple of notches, both in Jammu and Kashmir and in Punjab. A higher risk level could be taken, primarily because the potential of the escalation from India may not take place, thinking that the Chinese presence is very much there in Ladakh. Now, this is all a figment of imagination as far as Pakistan is concerned. India may not think that way at all, but this is the possibility, and this is something which may encourage Pakistan. And that is why 2022 is going to be a very important year, because we have seen that as early as the month of October, which is less than 3 months with what happened in Afghanistan, the end of the American withdrawal from there, in less than 3 months, you found a revival of the attempts, the low-level attempts in Jammu and Kashmir taking place, the targeting of minorities, for example, right? This was all to gain traction, regain traction all over again. Pakistan did succeed to some extent to send home that message that they were becoming relevant all over. And through this winter, we have seen that terrorist activity has continued. Success by the Indian Army has also continued to a very great extent. So we are not seeing the end of terror in Kashmir. We are looking at the beginnings of the potential exploitation of a situation in Punjab. We are looking at the global war on terrorism not having receded, or rather international and transnational terror not having taken a back step completely. Networks have very much existing in most of the regions, the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, Jammu and Kashmir, Punjab, and places like that, very much in existence. It's a question of 2022. How this year, which could be possibly the end of the seas, or possibly seeing the end of the pandemic too, how exactly is this going to pan out from here onwards? To my mind, 2022 could be a year of trial and error. It's a year in which the pandemic may continue to rule the roost, but as we come towards the end of the year and step into 2023 and beyond, you may find a revival of many of these networks. This is the time for us to actually look at neutralization of these networks. And that's my appeal always to the security forces, the international intelligence agencies and others, that wherever you find the potential of networks, financial, media, ideological, drug circuits, overground workers, anything like that, these must be neutralized if you really want to see peace at the end of the rainbow. Thank you very much. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, General, for a very discerning and, if I may say so, a very realistic perspective on the evolving situation this year. May I now request Dr. Yoram Schweitzer, who's an acknowledged authority on the field that we are discussing, to kindly give his views to our audience. Dr. Schweitzer.
Thank you for inviting me to this distinguished webinar, and with my distinguished colleagues. I will give a perspective from afar, from Israel, looking at it maybe from a more Western perspective. Before I start, I would like to make a few caveats because these are very important topics that I'm not going to address in this short time. One of them is the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, which is very devastating, and of course it's a very important issue that we in this rational discussion are not emphasizing, but this is a very crucial issue. The second one is the immigration issue, which is going to be affected by this withdrawal of the Americans and the situation in Afghanistan under the control of the Taliban. And the third issue is the drug issue, which I think may overshadow the terror impact of this Taliban regaining control in Afghanistan. I'm not going to address it. Maybe later on in the discussion we can deal with it. I would like to start with the impact of this withdrawal. If we take the testimony or the sound bites of the testimony of General Mark Milley, the head of Chiefs of Staff of the United States in Congress in 29th of September, when he titled the withdrawal as a strategic defeat, I think it was mistakenly put. It definitely encouraged the Taliban and its cohorts in their cognitive campaign that they are conducting all over. And later on, he elaborated on this title of this episode, and elaborated and basically retreated from this statement. But I think that the concept of, or the belief that the whole 20 years and the American withdrawal was a strategic defeat is definitely too early to judge, and I think it's a little bit over-exaggerated. Of course, it wasn't, I don't know of any happy and successful withdrawal, and this one was definitely in the last days of the withdrawal, and the image of the American being chased out of Afghanistan was wrongly put. And I think if the Americans had an accompanied cognitive warfare, which should have been done, and it's essential for portraying this strategic decision of the United States to withdraw from Afghanistan because of its multifaceted global interest that forced them to eventually leave Afghanistan after 20 years, after achieving their main aims at the beginning of the campaign, and later on develop some kind of unattainable ambitions that eventually President Biden decided to follow up on the decision that President Trump took in 2020 February, and basically this agreement was paving the way of the United States towards this withdrawal. And since we all know that Biden didn't want to stay in Afghanistan, even when he was vice president in 2010 and on, he wanted to conduct a remote combat in Afghanistan and not staying in hundreds of thousands of Americans staying in Afghanistan as a military force. Going to this arena of Afghanistan and the region following the withdrawal. First of all, again, I totally agree with my previous speaker that the impact of the cognitive victory that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are going to carve and portray from this withdrawal as if they won it militarily. We all know that this is a false narrative. We know that the Americans has not suffered a single casualty in the last year and a half of staying in Afghanistan. The Taliban didn't win over militarily. They took advantage of the corruption and the ineptitude, the inept Afghani government for a long time. And the fact that they portrayed in such a way, and again, the lack of cognitive warfare, effective cognitive warfare, and the situation on the ground basically helped them to encourage others to believe this mythos. And I think it will have effect on organization in the neighborhood. We already seen organizations that have nothing to do with the Taliban or the Sunnite Salafi jihadi groups like the Shiite axis in our region enjoying and dwelling on this victory, or rather the defeat of the Americans, to promote their own interests and to encourage more and more recruitment based on this alleged defeat. Coming to Afghanistan and to the situation, I think forward, I think that we shouldn't deal with predictions. We should deal with potential scenarios. I think it's too early to judge how it's going to be developed. I think it has a lot to do with the decisions and the capabilities of the Taliban to take control and to impose their government in Afghanistan. We all know the problems of central government in Afghanistan to control the whole country. I think the economic situation in Afghanistan, the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is very harsh, and we can barely see the Taliban taking control of the whole country and dealing effectively with the challenges that they have. So they will be bothered in this issue, mainly will be bothered in this issue of taking control of the country and basically governing it. In and when they will be able to do it, and the efforts that it will demand from them, they have the issue of the Al-Qaeda and the other Salafi jihadist groups that are already stationed in Afghanistan. I think the Afghani, the Taliban, and we have to watch it very carefully. The Taliban may have a very strong and vivid and bitter memory from the results of their behavior 20 years ago, which may in fact influence them to be very cautious and prudent in their foreign policy. They need their neighbors to somehow manage Afghanistan, and for their citizens. They will be probably cautious in provoking regional terrorism and definitely international terrorism. And I think it will shape the way that they are going to address the issue of Al-Qaeda. Nobody is naive enough. I hope that the Americans were not naive enough when they signed the treaty, the agreement in 2020 February, to believe that the Taliban would actually get rid of Al-Qaeda and kick them out of the country. It definitely didn't happen. Actually, they fulfilled maybe one paragraph from the agreement. Definitely Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which they couldn't and probably they wouldn't like to kick out of Afghanistan in those days, were not expelled from the country, and I think the relationships between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda will remain strong. I don't think, but we have to watch it. It's not a matter of belief, it's a matter of facts on the ground, that the Taliban will allow Al-Qaeda again to turn Afghanistan into an international training base. I think the Taliban will prevent Al-Qaeda from bringing back international fighters in droves to Afghanistan to be trained and to be prepared for an onslaught in the international arena. I'm not sure that the Al-Qaeda itself is either willing or ready for such a move. I think that we need to understand that Al-Qaeda of today is different than Al-Qaeda of 20 years ago, not in their character, but in their understanding of their own situation. I think Al-Qaeda is going under a shift in the leadership. The major players from the past has been either imprisoned or killed. The new generation is not well versed in the international affairs. I'm not sure that they are going to revert again to international terrorism in the short term. I don't know how it will develop in future, but I think that Al-Qaeda is not either Al-Qaeda is not interested in going international. We'll have to see whether they are going to harness themselves for maybe the Taliban wishes to be more effective in the region. Moving to IS Khorasan. I think that we need to understand that the situation now in the Salafi Jihadi part of the camp, the one that is being led by the remnants of IS after the military defeat, and especially the IS Khorasan, is not able, I think, to launch an international campaign and not even a regional campaign. I think that IS Khorasan would have liked to spread its influence in Afghanistan. It has an obstacle by the Taliban regime, which of course is being perceived by the IS Khorasan as a rivalry, as a serious rivalry, as the main rivalry in the area, in the region, and they will be engaged in fighting among themselves. I'm not sure that they will be available for trying to conduct regional terror operations in masses, and definitely I don't think it will help to revive the whole Islamic State remnants or the Daesh and its cohorts and partners around the world. I don't think that the IS Khorasan is capable of leading the whole camp of IS, of former IS. I don't think it has it in its capacity. I think it's too remote for launching the same campaign as the IS had successfully done for a certain period in the Levant. I think it's a different perspective to have somebody residing in the Levant and handling the situation in those specific circumstances that prevailed in 2014. Therefore, I think that if we look at the short term, I think the impact of the withdrawal of the Americans are not going to affect the international arena, besides giving an impetus to this psychological momentum of the Salafi jihadi camp in both camps, even in the rival adversarial camp of Al-Qaeda, which of course is a competitor for the IS. I think Al-Qaeda itself is not in its best position, although the nominal numbers of the Al-Qaeda partners have been increased. But the Al-Qaeda core was, I think, immensely weakened because of the leadership problem, because of the situation, because of the ramifications of the global war on terror. And we have to acknowledge that mostly is the Al-Qaeda partners that are influential and active around the world, and not Al-Qaeda itself. And I think the control of Al-Qaeda Central over these partners has been weakened, and even in the times of bin Laden, it wasn't that strong. They were very independent. Now they are much more independent. I don't think that they look at this international terror campaign as their main target. So that's when we look at future, at the near future at least, because we have to be very, very prudent when we try to prophesize. I think, as my previous speaker says, I think in the region it will probably have effect. The neighboring countries will have to address the challenges that terrorism in the region is put in front of them. I think the fact that the Americans are not there will put the burden on their shoulder, and we'll have to detect very closely what will be the relationship between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. How much liberty will the Taliban give Al Qaeda to operate outside of its borders? How much it will help Al Qaeda to bring back people from the diaspora to be trained and to stay there? And how will they cope with Daesh? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schweitzer, for a very optimistic perspective, almost a best case scenario. We say in India, tere muh mein ghee shakkar, means may there be a lot of sugar in your mouth. What it means is, may all what you say come true. I only want to point out that, it's an acknowledged reality that China and Pakistan have been allies for a very long time. If I may say so, China and the Pakistan military. And therefore, President Biden saying that he wants to concentrate on China and withdraw from Afghanistan, a location where Pakistan, as you know, has played a very important role over decades. For some of us, it didn't seem very logical. It is, of course, a Western perspective shared by many in the West over several decades. But I think there have been different perspectives in the West also that do not understand exactly why the Afghan army, for example, was kneecapped. And we're talking about the crisis in Afghanistan. Well, it was handed over on a platter to the Taliban. So I'm not entirely sure that these were the best decisions, but I do believe, your expertise is profound. It's much more than mine. And hopefully your assessment situation will turn out to be more accurate than mine has been. I would like to invite a renowned peace builder, Professor Javid Ahmad, now into this session. And, Professor Ahmad is well known in the sphere of peace building, and he's been trying to peace build between some very fractious parts of the world. And I would request him now to come and address us on this very important subject of what the Afghan pullout means for the future of the world, specifically reference to terrorism.
Thank you, Madhav.
Just a small interruption. Just a small interruption. Ambassador Javid Ahmad is former Afghan ambassador to UAE, and currently he's with the Atlantic Council. And we would really like to thank you, Ambassador. You're joining from DC, and it's 1:30 late in the night. So thank you so much for taking this trouble. Thank you.
Not a problem. But thank you, Madhav. Great to be here in this dialogue, and thank you, Dr. Pandya and the Usanis Foundation for having me today. I wish I was a peace builder, Madhav, because if I were, and we wouldn't be in a situation in Afghanistan today, because we will have a much more kind of tweaked version of the outcome that we saw on August 15, unfortunately. But I think my fellow previous speakers covered the crux of the topic. But for my part, what I will do is that I'll make a few additional observations for our discussion. But more specifically, I will make a few points about how the ecosystem of terrorism in that region is likely to transform going forward, from how I see it, and what the Taliban regime now in Afghanistan is doing in terms of contributing to this changing threat. So first, just a bit like on the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. We all saw how the United States ended its war in Afghanistan after a frustrating 20-year cycle, and I think quite simply, the US campaign in Afghanistan ended in this full circle where it actually started. With the Taliban, effectively restoring their lost emirate. And today, the aura of not just the withdrawal, the American withdrawal, but but the multi-front collective failure that we witnessed, which came like in the form of Afghanistan's collapse. That aura of failure very much surrounds us, and I think most of our discussion today, or at least what I heard from the future of terrorism to the region's own kind of ongoing reassessment and realignment of policy positions going forward, are happening in this broader perspective of American withdrawal from Afghanistan. But it was not just American withdrawal from Afghanistan; it was the American withdrawal from that region. But without getting into much details, I think it's fair to say that the Taliban fundamentally believed that they were undeterrable, and they were right in their own internal assessment, because they were a suicidal enemy at the end of the day. Their goals were very, very fixed, which was to take over the country and fundamentally change it. And for that goal, they were very much ready to pay any cost to achieve it. So for too long, neither side was winning in Afghanistan, but we increasingly saw, at least we saw it from the inside, how one side was losing more and more, and slowly. So the Taliban, on their part, operated with a certain conviction that any resistance against them, a foreign resistance or a domestic resistance, was essentially pointless. And then, unfortunately, in recent years, because the Taliban were considered an expensive enemy, some countries in that region, but also in Western capitals, including the capital that I'm sitting in right now, thought that the Taliban could prove to be a much cheaper partner than the previous government enterprise that they supported. But now, with the Taliban's return, there is also a buyer's remorse, because the Taliban rulers, they're essentially all about a Taliban first policy, and they have shown to be, quite unmanageable at this point. So, but it's also no surprise that they're, the Taliban are governing, on their own absolute terms. They've said it all along that that's exactly how they would do it. So it shouldn't come as a surprise. And the Taliban also wants the world right now to be accommodating to them on their own terms as well. Now, did we misjudge the Taliban? Absolutely not. But did we misjudge or altogether ignore the enabling external factors that facilitated the Taliban's return to power? Absolutely yes. And I think this was something that was mentioned before as well by the previous speakers, including by the ambassador. And that's I think one of those, gross misjudgments that we made was about accepting, Pakistan's nefarious role as business as usual. And I would argue that, in truth, the United States never had a winning chance in Afghanistan because of the Pakistan problem, because the Pakistanis and Pakistani establishment always provided the Taliban this, longer term predictability in their partnership. And in contrast, the Afghan government, or the previous Afghan government, arguably didn't always have that predictability from, longer term predictability from their partners. Yes, the Afghan government was a powder keg. It was full of problems. But this, erratic Western approach that, we are staying today, for example, in Afghanistan, but we're leaving, next week, that kind of erratic approach didn't quite help in terms of creating that longer term predictability. But what Pakistan did, they always maintained that predictable nature of its very, symbiotic partnership, like with the Taliban. They never put, for example, a timeline or an artificial deadline on their support or partnership with the Taliban. It was always an open-ended partnership, of course, with some tactical exceptions. It's over now, but but the problem is still there, and I think that problem is what we need to pay much more attention to going forward. And I think a more fundamental challenge with respect to dealing with Pakistan is that, in my view, that they never overcome what the Pakistani leaders believed was a 20-year American humiliation. I think that blunt U.S. message in 2001 that was delivered to Pakistan, that you're with us or against us, is a fundamental part of that, humiliation that Pakistan felt. But unfortunately, that message, that very same message or a similar message, was never repeated to Pakistan in this 20-year campaign in Afghanistan. And I think that's perhaps the single most important factor in my view, and why the United States was always staring at a defeat in Afghanistan. And I think here I must also say that the U.S. withdrawal was not just a single defeat. It was one part of a multifaceted defeat, and I think that defeat is not over yet until the United States deals with these kind of multiple Pakistans that we're dealing with, or this kind of multiple variants of that country. And I think those variants, just like the COVID virus, are increasingly manifesting themselves in this post-American Afghanistan. And I think what's unfortunate is that Pakistan is skillfully managing to weather all kinds of pressures, all kinds of transitions by their public diplomacy, smoke and mirrors, their charm offensives and whatnot. And I'm afraid they will continue to do so, going forward, especially now that the United States is, either uninterested in that region or in Afghanistan, or distracted by other challenges. And I think the Taliban will increasingly follow the Pakistani playbook as they begin to govern, or I must say, rule Afghanistan. This takes me to my second point about the changing nature of terrorism challenge. And I think to contextualize this, I think it's very important to look closely at the Taliban regime right now and examine how they're shaping up this broader skeleton of their new ideological state. The Taliban, and this was spoken by other speakers as well, they've long been clear about their desire to establish a purely Islamic state. And so today, the Taliban new rulers are doing exactly that. They are on an organized march to make their newly installed interim government permanent. Before there was a temptation to make this temporary permanent. Now there is an actual desire to make this temporary permanent. And I think to do this, what they're doing is that they're making sweeping and radical changes on several fronts. I'm going to mention a few of them just for for context. First is that these new rulers are laying the grounds to transform their religious movement into a permanent ideology, the Talibanism, a customized blend of very puritanical Deobandi philosophy and their own Taliban sets of beliefs that's glued together by Islamic Sharia. And I think this ideology increasingly view the society, the Afghan society and beyond, as a struggle between godliness and manliness. And I think it dictates in very strong terms that Islam is about all aspects of daily life, and it has to be lived. It's not just preached. And I think it considers the Afghan society to be not properly Islamic, and they must Islamize, and either by invitation or coercions. And I think it also rejects all forms of Republican rule and values as essentially evil, because it follows the provision of men. And I think it makes a very marked and clear distinction between Islamic law and man-made laws, in which they said that man's laws are immoral and corrupt because it follows the whims of a corrupt man. So that's one. But broadly under this, the idea here is that by re-Islamizing the Afghan society, this Talibanism as an ideology, they want to make Afghanistan great again. So the second point is that the Taliban rulers, they are also revalidating themselves as a vanguard for a true Islamic leadership of Afghanistan. There are, of course, just like multiple variants of Pakistan, there are many variants of Taliban as well. But there's a very specific cluster of religious clerics that effectively drive the movement, and that serve as the Taliban's nerve center. And unlike the Taliban's ideological pragmatists, these clerics are originalists, who view Islam as a tip of the spear, and they also see Quran as their constitution. So these originalists operate through this loose set of policy action documents. They call it dastur, and they consider this clerics approved unitary Islamic state as a model state. But what this broader jihadi fraternity is doing is that they operate under a belief that power is never willingly relinquished and it has to be taken by force. And in that regard, the new rulers and their fighting force and followers across the board, they merely consider themselves as soldiers in God's army. And that's how they rationalize their apocalyptic jihadism and call them virtuous and their violence largely righteous. So when you talk to them about the recognition of a Taliban state, they don't care about the outsiders, because they believe that the recognition of the Taliban state stems and originates from the Taliban's own community of followers and their fighters. And I think in the third and most important point is that these rulers are re-engineering the principle of Afghan nationalism to directly align with and comport with Islamic nationalism. So Afghanistan has always had its own struggle to finding some kind of an acceptable middle ground between the moderate Islam and the medieval Islam, and it's no secret. But what the Taliban is doing is that they're marrying the Afghan nationalism with Islamic nationalism, or this trap of fake nationalism, and using them to coalesce and to unite the country around itself. And for them to do so, their emerging re-Islamization agenda involves creating this new narrative of the Taliban version of Afghan Islam, which includes a whole bunch of things, from imposing a singular Islamic Afghan identity on all Afghans, to a single national education curriculum, irrespective of Afghanistan religious diversity. And so they are weaponizing Islam to purify the Afghan society, in which they promise a pure Islamic state free of men's perversion. And I think it's exactly along these lines that they're also going to develop a national security force, which in their mind can fight and can win. And I think that's precisely why one of the special battalions is a suicide brigade, which they will be developing. So in whatever they're doing, they are enforcing compliance, and they're removing any kinds of competitions, political or religious, before they even emerge. And of course, there's exploitable space there on the ground for the Taliban to easily exploit, from madrasas to a society that's culturally religious, to this growing competition between modernism and cultural religiosity, to this unnatural fascination with martyrdom, which actually requires an enemy. So with madrasa education, routine across the formative years, like in the country, so there's a great deal of exploitable space for them to exploit. But what they're offering is a sense of belonging, in this case, to scores of unemployable Afghans. And in this case, they're also promising and offering a license for direct action. I think this was something that was mentioned earlier as well. Beyond this, what is happening is, in many ways, the Taliban's this political Islamism, it also comports very closely with the Muslim Brotherhood's experiment themselves. The Muslim Brotherhood did it. They marginalized women, non-Muslims, anyone who was not an Islamist. And I think that strict political Islamism that they put in place in Egypt eventually steered, the Muslim Brotherhood as a movement to become a victim of its own ambitions. And I think the Taliban following that playbook as well. They've banished women, controlled the media. They've converted social justice into revenge killings. They're forcing a single Afghan identity on people. Representative values are nowhere to be seen. They're resisting inclusive government. So there's this dangerous path of imposed nationalism and identity politics, which I think have already created an existential crisis of coexistence across the board. One final point. beyond this, there are also other challenges of that have effectively plagued this militant Emirates survival. One is this evolving struggle among competing Taliban factions in this Taliban plus government, which I will call, which has elements of terrorist groups like in senior ranks, including in governing ranks. This includes the Haqqanis in the cabinet and other ranks across the board who still remain in bed with Al-Qaeda. Domestically, I think these kind of upstream leadership tensions between the Haqqanis and this larger southern Taliban factions overpowered. They've caused downstream effects already, including factional fighting and internal clashes. There's also at the same time tensions that have gained steam between the Taliban and Salafist groups that was mentioned before, including ISIS-K, which have expanded its violence against the Taliban. They've accused them of imposing an exclusively Hanafi state in Afghanistan. So I think there's this danger that could spill out about Takfiri jihadism as well. Beyond this, there is this Taliban romanticization of its military victory, which has elevated its position in the global jihadist propaganda. Al-Qaeda issued a statement that celebrated Taliban's victory. In one of the Al-Qaeda statements that I read, it says that it effectively glorified the Taliban and called them, and I quote, breaking America's back. So they've described Afghanistan as the impregnable fortress of Islam. They've pushed for the Taliban and praised them for not abandoning the way of jihad and martyrdom. And I think in some ways they very, very clearly appeal to the Afghan nation, in this case, to unite around the Taliban's leadership in this case. So what is alarming is, and I think this was mentioned in the first panel, is that this takeover, the Taliban's takeover, has presented a practical template for victory to this raft of puritanical groups who are burnishing now their jihadi credentials, and all because it reinforces the value of jihad, that jihad works or terrorism works. And what is unsurprising in this case is that thousands of fighters have already poured into Afghanistan. There's story after story, including the Washington Post. There was one senior Al-Qaeda aide to Osama bin Laden who publicly broadcasted his return to Afghanistan. He was one time his bodyguard, maybe not so good one. There's also a network of overlapping groups that's patiently reorganizing their forces. There's a likelihood and a possibility of tactical partnerships that could be built. And I think there's also this allure of Taliban takeover across jihadist groups and jihadist propaganda in the virtual space, on Telegram and Twitter and Facebook. On Twitter, they're openly hosting spaces conversations. So there's also a growing pool of jihadists who are now proudly using Taliban monikers like Al-Afghani, Al-Emirati, Al-Omari, Al-Mansuri, because they're proud and they're sporting those kind of monikers. And there are also others who are exploiting these technology to recruitment, to fundraise virtually from Taliban's this now growing community of virtual supporters. Finally, I think that this dangerous blend of shifting terror trends that we see not just in Afghanistan, but I think their tactical partnerships with a range of foreign terrorist groups in the middle of a humanitarian tragedy. I think it's a recipe for a perfect storms going forward. But having said all that, there is no drive-through solutions here in terms of solutions. So I think terror groups are likely to converge. They're going to reorganize. We're likely going to see tactical partnerships getting formed between a basket of these groups who will find a common populist winning message for their future activities. I think each of these groups are one way or the other the alumni of the Afghan war, and I think they will bring their own competitive and comparative advantages and capabilities to the battlefield. So this possible tactical convergence in which battlefield tactics will be married to technology, will also increase the tactical staying power of these jihadist groups. So in my view, this reorganization that's happening perhaps over this winter as countries and capitals take some time to reassess their positions, militant groups are doing exactly the same thing. I think this is something that we need to pay a particular attention to. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And may I say that, it's a brilliant presentation. I wish that you had been given an hour to develop your thoughts further. I would only like to say that from 1999, I was made a UNESCO Peace Chair. And my effort has always been not to promote peace and not to provoke a war. And I was informed about you that you have tried multiple times to bring multiple individuals, multiple groups together to ensure a moderate, progressive Afghanistan, which, in my view, is what Islam represents. Modern, progressive. That is the future of Islam. That's the future of humanity. So I would only like to say once again, thank you for that. Except that my only difference with you is that I would not use the word Pakistan. I would use the word Pakistan military. The people of Pakistan and the Pakistan military are two entirely different forces. But otherwise, I completely agree with your assessment of situation. And I do hope that, all the different countries that are represented here, their leaders will ensure that the future of Afghanistan is the future that you have been tirelessly working for I was told, about 3 decades. God bless you, Ambassador. Now, in fact, with your permission, I'd like to open this for a few questions. Whoever is asking the questions, I'd like that individual to unmute himself or herself, start the video, and directly post the question to the speaker who you would like a reply from. Thank you very much. Let's open the floor to questions.
Madhav, sir, I have a question for Ambassador Javid. Ambassador Javid, thank you very much for this amazing presentation. Now, since you are from Afghanistan, I just, I have my own concerns and doubts about this ISKP being a new narrative. Okay, would you throw some light on the relationship between the ISKP and Pakistan's strategic establishment? Is it just a new kind of a bogeyman which Pakistan's intelligence has created to get more American dollars and continue its business of terror? Because as far as my research in terrorism is concerned, I have felt that no terror group in South Asia can operate without the blessings of Pakistan military.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what about 2 years ago, under the facade of negotiating peace, the Taliban's military hardliners, they were allegedly working. We had some information that was shared with us by the Afghan intelligence at that time and they had set in motions these tactical alliances with other non-Taliban groups as part of their basically double game to continue fighting on one side and also disrupting peace efforts on the other. And I think one of those relationship related to reports that I saw about these growing ties between the Haqqanis and ISIS-K. There was also some pieces of information that was embedded into a UN report that year. I think it was like 2018, 2019, that emphasized the Haqqanis this evolved partnership with ISIS-K. And it noted that most ISIS-K claimed attacks had some degree of involvement in facilitation or provision of technical assistance by the Haqqanis. Now, operationally, it's hard to tell who ISIS-K really was. I mean, at one point, I believed that it was some kind of a manufactured project, because when we look at the composition, but also the actual emergence of ISIS-K when it emerged in 2014, it emerged from disgruntled Pakistani Taliban members or Afghan Taliban members who didn't feel comfortable operating under the Taliban's umbrella, the Afghan Taliban's umbrella. So they started a new group, and ISIS-K at that time was, or ISIS core at that time was the big dog. So everyone wanted to engage in that. And so that's when, the issue of takfiri jihadism, became much more elevated. But operationally, I think the Haqqanis, they also sought this lethal triangle, not just with ISIS-K, but there was a third group, Lashkar-e-Taiba in this case, and they lent active training and logistical support to, like on that front. And I think until at least, mid 2021, this partnership was still very much operational. So this is what I saw. Now, whether the Pakistanis are involved in that, I can't see anything. I don't have any hard evidence or circumstantial evidence to speak to that one. That's one. The second is, I think that, since the Taliban's take over, takfiri jihadism and sectarian violence that concerns groups, Salafist groups like ISIS-K, has really increased. So there was one attack in November that was reportedly claimed by ISIS-K. It killed the Taliban senior commander from the Kabul military corps, Molay Hamdullah Mukhlis. And so it is added to, already this, Salafist jihadism, ISIS-K's role is already added to insecurity in certain parts of the country. I think the Taliban have gone after, them, but it's in some cases they've also, downplayed it. So they've not only gone after ISIS-K, but also Salafist civilians in some provinces like Kunar and Nangarhar. So I think there is this threat. We will see. I think when the Taliban can manage it, and if they do a military consolidation into larger cities and population centers, that vacuum of more ungoverned spaces will be created, and that vacuum could easily be filled by groups like ISIS-K or tactical partnerships and alliances that's created with ISIS-K support. So we will see. But for now, I think it's hard to tell as to who exactly is supporting this, but they are paying big buck.
I just want to add a small point here, and judging by the research that I have conducted with my sources, rather than put it as ISIS-K versus Taliban, it's basically, as the ambassador very correctly said, factions within the Taliban that are now active. And some of these factions include members of what we call ISIS-K. Many of these definitions, many of these so-called, labeling is a little unreal because you have shifting labels. So, I mean, of course, this is based on the information that I have. But again, I'd like to say I would like to entirely endorse what the ambassador is saying. And now, if there are any other questions, I would request that individual to please post them directly to the speaker from whom you'd like the answer, to the three discussants from whom you'd like the answer. Thank you very much.
Sure. Madhav, could I just add quickly to my last point? At one point in Afghanistan, when the violence increased, and this was during the Afghan peace talks, there will be two simultaneous attacks in the same city, say Kabul. One would be on the military installation, another one would be on the civilian installation. The Taliban would take responsibility on the attack that would be happening, or the attack on the military installation. ISIS-K would take the attack on the civilian installations or on civilian institutions and establishments, including mosques and others. Just to add it, so you could tell that there was this tactical coordination on the ground, and it was hard to tell. But we didn't see a difference between ISIS-K guys or Taliban guys, because they operated from the same corners.
And with the same, if I may say so, force multiplied, the Pakistan Army.
Yes,
absolutely.
There's a gentleman called Mr. Ashish Kumar. I don't know whether he's available immediately, but I'll just read out his question. It is being said that the war on terror formally started after the 9/11 attack. Now, with the withdrawal of the US forces and takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, was this the end state with which this war on terror was started? I don't know what really he's meaning on that. Or are we on the losing end in this war against terrorism? Rather, had the Afghan forces been empowered to take on Taliban on their own, without any outside assistance, then in my opinion, it would have been considered a victory against terror. I'm not sure whether he's very, very focused on what he is exactly saying. Maybe Ambassador Javid Ahmed may like to briefly comment on that, because it really isn't. Can you read it, Ambassador?
No, I actually can't see it.
Okay. I'll take out the next one. There is Ambika Bhargav. Is this Ambika Bhargav? Yeah. I'll read out your question, Ambika. Should India and the allies help the resistance group of Ahmad Masood in Panchayat to counter the Taliban or the ISIS, Harassah, and others in Afghanistan? Now, I will give a very brief response to this, and let's see, my fellow panelists may have to say much more, perhaps. Yes. To my mind, we are at the moment in a very, very awkward state as far as India is concerned. You know, with the withdrawal of our embassy, with the withdrawal of all our diplomatic connections, etc., we were seen to be very defensive of this whole thing, but now proactively, with some diplomatic activity, we have got back onto the high table, almost onto the high table now, in the sense that the Taliban has accepted our assistance and has spoken something very positive about the humanitarian assistance which has reached there, the COVID vaccines which have been received by them, etc. So this is the beginning, right at the beginning, this re-establishment of a working relationship with the Taliban. Now, at this stage, to be saying whether you should be in touch with the resistance forces, if you are the only organization, I mean, India as one country by itself, I would never go along with it. But if there is an international thing put together, if there are coalitions, if there are people leading it, if there are resources available, there is a leadership and there is an end state in mind, perhaps you could consider, well, lending it some kind of support. But I think it's a little premature at this moment. The situation in Afghanistan is still very, very tenuous. And as the good ambassador just brought out, it seems the Taliban is on the high. It obviously are progressing very well as far as their side is concerned. For us to be seen to be doing this would nip, right at this state, nip whatever efforts have succeeded in reaching out and cultivating the Taliban. I'm not sure whether we need to cultivate the Taliban, but we need to go along and make sure that we remain relevant in this area. And to my mind, that may not happen so immediately if we are seen to be in league with the resistance groups. Maybe the good ambassador may like to comment on that.
Good Ambassador Ahmad or Dr. Schweitzer, would you like to comment on this particular question? I think it's a very important question.
First, I think maybe I misunderstood the time frame, and I was very short in my introduction. But I would like to address your comment that depicted me as an ardent optimist and sugarcoating the reality. Let me assure you, now I'm speaking as an Israeli, that I'm not very naive, and I know terrorists, how they are and who they are and what they want. And I was trying to counter a common belief in the West. I framed it as a Western approach that maybe too alarmist towards the short-range ramifications of the withdrawal of the American from Afghanistan. That was my predisposition. I don't have any illusions about the Salafi jihadists. I don't have any illusions about the Taliban itself, how they are going to rule Afghanistan, the way they want to design the rule in Afghanistan. I definitely don't look at Al-Qaeda as a peaceful movement. I was appalled to hear a depiction of Al-Qaeda as a Salafi, a light Salafi jihadist group when IS was established. I think, and this is what I pointed out, that we need to detect how Al-Qaeda behave, how the Taliban behave towards Al-Qaeda, trying to export terrorism, either to the region, definitely to the international arena. There was one question that I saw in the audience that was addressed to me, whether I think that people from Idlib will come to Afghanistan. to be trained there or to be absorbed in Al-Qaeda. I think I would like to make a judo to this question and to say that I'm more worried the future of Salafi jihadist terrorism from what will emanate from Syria and the region, from these remnants of the war in Syria and in Iraq, to the international terrorism in the future. I think there are cadres that are in the Middle East that were embittered and were trained and indoctrinated by the war in our region, that will go out eventually to take part in terrorism, international terrorism or regional terrorism. This is something that we should look. I would be more worried of the people in El Hol camp in Syria rather than today in Afghanistan. There is no question in my mind, knowing Al-Qaeda, even there is a new generation of Al-Qaeda, and knowing their philosophy, that they will continue to carry out terrorist operations, whether it will be in the region or internationally, but it will take time. That was my point, and I want to make it very clear.
Thank you, Dr. Schweitzer, for that clarification. I think we had another individual with a question. If that person can put on his video and ask the question directly, or else, Aditya, if you can just read out the question, any of the other questions, if you don't mind.
May I read it out if you so, because it's right in front of me here.
Please go ahead, sir.
Okay. So, Ambika has got a second question also, but there's another third question, which is, I think, also fairly interesting. So I'll read both these questions. Ambika Bhargav says, every United Nations, even the United Nations, is turning a blind eye to the existing humanitarian crisis and violation of human rights by the Taliban, especially against women intellectuals and progressive Afghans. So who is going to be taking control of this crisis created by Pakistan, but supported by China, Turkey, and even Russia to an extent? In other words, she's basically saying, who is in charge? I mean, in this whole mishmash of the game, who is in charge? Let's just address this question, perhaps, Professor Madhav. And then the second question is related to Kashmir, which I shall answer.
Well, possibly the Ambassador Ahmad would like to respond to this first question.
Sure. Well, it is a crippling humanitarian crisis. Unfortunately, ultimately, the Afghans are in charge, but the buck stops right now with the Taliban and their regime and their rulers to help the Afghans. They need to moderate their ways, but I think in the end of the day, humanitarian assistance, even though America's approach to Afghanistan in terms of engagement is quite minimalist at this point. So their approach is what I would describe as less is more, and in the humanitarian front too. Less is more, so in their mind. So, but in the end of the day, humanitarian assistance is also inherently political. It's merely a band-aid. What happens when you rip off that band-aid? So I think we need to ask ourselves whether you can run a country of over 30 million people with humanitarian assistance, and if so, for how long? And I think here we need to consider the risk of creating another parallel economy, like they did with the previous government that was solely dependent on aid. Second thing is that we also still don't know how much Afghanistan actually need for the next 3 to 6 months, so that people could actually survive the winter. The budget that the Taliban has reportedly put together has not been made public yet. So, but the budget that they've put together, they have reportedly said that it's coming all coming from their own internal resources that they have collected from custom revenues, from taxations, from aviation, and others from telecom, for example. So we still don't know as to how much we actually need in the next 3 to 6 months. Right now, the United Nations is providing about $12 to $15 million every 2 weeks. So for the next 2.5, 3 months, like until the end of March, they will be providing about $280 million, but that's still not enough. How much of that money goes to ordinary people and how that's distributed still remains largely unclear. And whether they're doing it themselves or are there leakages to the Taliban, we also don't know. Are they doing it through the NGOs? And if so, which NGOs? Do they have nationwide presence? We also don't know. The third is that I think on the methods to actually provide those funds, each option that's been explored so far or discussed so far has their own limits, from currency swaps to creating, parallel central bank or using one or two of the private banks. So that's a challenge. I think what's critical for transparency purposes, I think I will argue not to over-depend too much on the traditional banking thing, just, at least in the immediate terms, at least, for Afghans to survive this winter. I think that before the collapse, we had 12 commercial banks in Afghanistan. There were 3 state banks. There were 7 private banks. And then there were also 2 branches of foreign banks, or banks that had corresponding banking relationship with foreign banks. Right now, maybe one bank, AIB, which is the Afghanistan International Bank, has that corresponding banking relationship with the bank. But since the collapse, the people have also lost confidence in traditional banking system. Plus, maybe about 15 to 20% of the people have bank accounts, and most of those people have since left Afghanistan as well. So, and also most of those banks don't have provincial or large-scale nationwide presence. So this is a problem for us, and that kind of takes us to alternative options like the Hawala system, which is quite decentralized. So, but that also has its own limits, like the U.S. Treasury, the OFAC compliance issues. It'd be very difficult to ensure with large Hawala transactions. There will be, direct leakages to the Taliban, unless we come up with a creative solution, like, identifying a select network of Hawala dealers and then only deal with them. So, but right now, whatever support is provided to Afghanistan, the Taliban, one way or the other, it benefits from it. I think the donor countries will need to come perhaps come up with some kind of an accommodation or a consensus to determine what level of leakage to the Taliban will be acceptable, and then see if they can moderate their behavior, because ultimately they're responsible.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think, if you look at a farming analogy, let's say that you have a lot of water. The problem is having irrigation canals that can send the water directly to the fields that are parched. I think that is the question now. General Hasnain, would you please reply to the other question?
If I may have your permission, Professor Nalapat, I will just very briefly also respond to this question. I think this particular question also, besides alluding to the whole aspect of development, of aid, humanitarian assistance, etc., which has been so appropriately addressed by our good ambassador, I think there's also an issue of these politico-strategic control, which was being alluded to here. Who really is looking? You see, for 20 years, the Americans were in charge. So that has left some kind of an impression that someone needs to be in charge. It's not necessary that someone has to be in charge. In international politics, who can really be in charge of a region such as this? The man at the outset, around 15th of August, between 15th and 31st of August, the Russians seem to be the people who were very, very keen to ensure that they had a major role to play. The Russian embassy did not move out. If you remember, the Russian embassy is still very much there. Iranians were playing a major role. They continued to play a major role. Pakistan, of course, was trying to rule the roost, the whole thing. The people who were most concerned, who should be most concerned about turbulence within Afghanistan? Of course, it is the Western countries, the United States, etc., who probably perceive threats emerging, something like what happened with 9/11 and coming back all over again. But the people who really need to be concerned are the Central Asian countries and Russia. And I think a discussion with most Russian strategists will tell you that this is something which worries them sick. They don't want things like this happening in Central Asia. They don't want a gravitation of these influences and these ideologies moving into the 5 republics, coming closer to Chechnya, coming closer to Dagestan and places like that. So I think the Russians have been very proactive in their diplomacy also. They outreach to India, they outreach to others. The Iranians initially took a tremendous amount of interest, but somehow petered out thereafter. We will see through this year, 2022, probably an increasing interest returning as far as the United States itself is concerned. I don't think the US can really wash itself off completely from here. If it thinks it's a clean break and then it's a clean break from the Middle East and you're moving towards the Indo-Pacific, I don't think international politics play out that way. You left behind a footprint here over 20 years. You need to continue doing something about it. I'm not sure how the Americans are going to do it, but I do perceive that the US will continue to play a larger political strategic game here, along with the Russians, perhaps, along with the Russians.
Well, they need to play together, the Russians, if they can.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Would you like to, the last question?
Yeah, that's the last question here. It's related to the Kashmir, It's from a gentleman called Jitendra, Mr. Jitendra. US withdrawal from Afghanistan is considered a strategic defeat for the United States. The same theme is now propagated by various terrorist tanzeems operating in the Kashmir Valley. The armed forces, that's the Indian armed forces, in a way have been able to contain the same. However, one odd collateral damage could pull them back, which means that one collateral damage or a major mistake made by the armed forces would have to force the armed forces to pull back. Do you think we need a much stronger political will to contain the same, supported by a strong media management policy? Actually, what they're looking at in this question is essentially what's happened in Afghanistan. Can you really apply the same principles here in Kashmir, where you found that the Americans ran out of stamina and moved out of Kashmir, out of Afghanistan, despite their interests remaining there still? Can the same thing happen to Kashmir? It's a very different situation because Kashmir is a part of India. Afghanistan was never a part of the United States. So here, first of all, I think the question is slightly flawed in the sense that even with a collateral damage, even with a bit of a mistake, which occurs once in a while when you are conducting these kind of operations, the Indian armed forces, the government of India has never been of the opinion that it needs to pull back. Pull back in this case would mean pull back the army perhaps and withdraw AFSPA completely and only hand over the whole situation to the local police. I don't think that kind of a situation is anywhere emerging in the future. It is such a unpredictable kind of an environment in which we are functioning. We're just seeing the beginnings of Pakistan attempting to regain a tremendous amount of traction here, spread its influence into Punjab and things like that. So I don't think we are looking at anything like that. The Indian Armed Army is going to remain very strongly in Kashmir. Kashmir is a part of India, and the Indian Army needs to be there to ensure it defends it against all opposition. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Abhinav, we have reached the end of this very important session.
Yes, I just have two questions for Schweitzer, sir. Two very simple questions. Sir, I mean, I'm really curious about the impact of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan on Iran's interest in Afghanistan and about the status of Iran-supported proxy terror groups in the wider Middle Eastern region. First question. And second, when we see that ISIS-K has really emerged very strong in Afghanistan, and ISIS is also emerging, like they're trying to regroup in Sahel region in Africa. Do you visualize any kind of a unification between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, or some kind of a synergized global effort on the terror front? For Schweitzer, sir.
I'll address the second question because I didn't really hear the first one, but I think that this cooperation between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, this was a major question, I think, a few years ago. And I think in this situation, the cooperation between these two entities, we see each other in a very adversarial fashion, is not likely to happen in the near future. I don't know about the long future. I think the animosity, the rivalry, the different strategies, because they have the same vision, but the different strategy guarantees, with all due cautious needed, that they won't be united, neither in the African region nor in the South Asia region. If I got correctly the question about the Iranian interest in Afghanistan, and the influence of the withdrawal on.
Should I repeat the question?
Yes, please. Please.
Should I repeat the question? Yeah.
Please.
So I was basically interested in knowing the impact of US withdrawal from Afghanistan on Iran's activities and interest in Afghanistan, because we have been hearing that Iran has its tie-ups with both with the people who were present in the American-supported government establishment and also with the Taliban, and the impact of the US withdrawal on the Iran-supported proxy terror groups in the wider Middle Eastern region. I mean, in general.
Okay. In addition to what the general said before me, I think that the Iranians are among those states who are very worried about what happened in Afghanistan. Although it seems maybe strange that their major rivalry adversary, United States, they should have gloated because the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. I think they did, but they understand that the Taliban is not their friend and they are not their partner. I think they recognize the basic vehement adversarial position of the Taliban against Iran, and I think the Iranians will try to mitigate the impact of this withdrawal and the control of the Taliban. I think they see it in a very worrying fashion, and they are not very pleased, and they won't be pleased by the Taliban control of Afghanistan. I think we are going to see skirmishes. We've already seen, plus they suffered the immigration from Afghanistan in high numbers. I don't think it's healthy for the economy, and I don't think they are happy about it. As much of the influence on the Iranian Shiite axis in our region, I think, again, we didn't address enough time, I think, to the psychological impact and the momentum that the Taliban victory or alleged victory or perceived victory, definitely by the Taliban, on the entire world. The global jihadists definitely are going to use it in order to recruit people and to use it as part of their legacy and assured victory in future against all enemies. It also was expressed by the Shiite extremists in our region. Nasrallah, for example, the leader of Hezbollah, has been using the American defeat, as it call it, and others, including in this session, are calling it, and trying to encourage its constituency to follow up their policy because they see American as a tiger paper. And I think the impact, the psychological impact, the cognitive warfare that they are conducting and has been part and parcel of their fight against the West and against their enemies, the allies of the United States and everyone who is opposing their strategy, is something that they want to expand on and to use it for their own advantage. So there is a bad ramification in this psychological atmosphere that we are going to see in future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schweitzer. And I just want to say that I don't want to stand between you and everybody else and lunch, but I'd like to say that I was personally delighted to listen to the excellent presentations by our three speakers. I can only say that this is the tip of the iceberg. Their knowledge goes way beyond what has been revealed in this particular session. And I'm sure there'll be many more sessions and other discussions in which more and more of this iceberg of knowledge of all the three speakers is revealed. Thank you very much, Abhinav, for giving me this opportunity, and God bless everyone here. Jai Hind.